Nobody filed a missing persons report for a crate. That was the thing I kept coming back to in the weeks and months afterward, when I had the luxury of coming back to things. Nobody filed a report. Nobody placed a call to the waystation authority office. Nobody flagged an incomplete manifest or submitted a customs query or sent so much as a one-line message asking whether a particular piece of freight had arrived safely. The crate sat in Bay 19 of the Haverson Transit Hub, Outpost Verada, a waystation on the cold shoulder of the Tethin Passage, for 11 days before my rounds brought me to it. 11 days in which the galaxy, in all its vast administrative diligence, did not notice that anything was wrong. I noticed because the crate had a water seal running at draw level, which meant the internal climate unit was cycling, which meant something alive was inside, which meant the manifest was wrong. I had been the Haverson's transit compliance officer for 19 years. 19 years of manifests, of discrepancy forms, of the particular exhausting arithmetic of keeping track of what belongs to whom in a place specifically designed to be a waypoint, a place where everything is passing through and nothing is meant to stay. I was good at it the way a man can be good at a thing he was never passionate about. Thorough, methodical, present in the way a man without anywhere better to be tends to be present. The Haverson was not an exciting post. The Tethin Passage carried middle-tier commercial freight, mineral slurry from the cavernous extraction fields, prefab construction elements, seed stocks, medicinal compound shipments, and the occasional mixed cargo load from the outer settlement clusters, the kind of load where half the items on the manifest were listed simply as miscellaneous goods, because the shipper hadn't had time or inclination to be more specific. I processed 100 crates a week. I walked the bays on a schedule. I kept the records current. The bays themselves were unglamorous spaces, long, low-ceilinged, lit by composite strip panels that gave everything a flat, toneless quality. The smell was transit hub universal, recycled air, hydraulic compound, the faint metallic residue of docking seal equipment. Bay 19 was a secondary bay, smaller, typically allocated to individual consignments awaiting collection. It sat at the end of the portside corridor, the last stop on my weekly rounds. The crate in Bay 19 had arrived on the Oregon Hauler, a mid-range freight vessel with a mixed commercial manifest, 11 days prior to my inspection. It had been logged as miscellaneous household goods, personal relocation, consignee to collect on arrival. The consignee name on the manifest was a personal identifier code I later traced to a registration that had been canceled 8 months before the crate ever boarded the Oregon. Whoever had loaded that crate onto a freight hauler, whoever had written the manifest, whoever had paid the transit fees, they had done it under the name of someone who no longer existed in any official registry. They had done it deliberately, and they had not come to collect. I had gone through the proper notification channels first, 3 days of repeated messages to the consignee code, 2 escalation flags to station administration, a formal hold notice. Nothing. The station manager, a tired man named Brennick who was 6 months from retirement and had the 1,000-yard look of someone counting days, told me to inventory the contents and log them as unclaimed property for holding. If nobody came forward in 30 days, the contents would be assessed for resale or disposal. So I brought my inventory scanner, and I broke the cargo seal on crate BN19, and I opened it. She was sitting in the back corner, knees pulled to her chest, arms wrapped around a small cloth bundle that I would later realize was a doll she had made herself from scraps of packing material and a torn piece of thermal lining. She was not curled up as if she were sleeping. She was upright, deliberate, the way a creature sits when it has decided that whatever is coming next, it will face it with its eyes open. Her eyes were very large, and the irises were a pale amber that seemed almost lit from within, though that might have been the crate's climate strip throwing light at an angle. Her skin was a soft dusty blue, the color of still water under a winter sky, and her ears came to fine points at the tips. She was small in the way of a young thing, not precisely frail, not precisely sturdy, but with the particular quality of a living thing that has been requiring more of its reserves than was intended. Her clothing was a simple garment, something that might have once been a uniform tunic, now oversized on her small frame and worn at the cuffs. Her hair was the pale silver white of frost on a window, and it was carefully arranged, which told me something about her even then, though I could not have said precisely what. She looked at me. She did not speak. She did not, as I had half expected and half feared, make a sound of distress. She watched me with those amber eyes, and she waited to see what I would do. I have thought about that moment many times. I have tried to reconstruct what I was thinking, whether there was a clear sequence of reasoning or simply a cascade of recognition. This is a child. This child is alone. This child has been alone for 11 days in a sealed crate with a climate unit and a water supply that was designed for a shorter duration than 11 days, and whoever put this child here is not coming back. I do not remember thinking any of that in sequential order. What I remember is crouching down. I went to one knee almost without deciding to, the way your body moves ahead of your instructions sometimes, and I set the inventory scanner on the floor of the crate, and I said, in a voice that came out quieter than I intended, "Hello, I'm Garrison. I work here." She studied me for a long moment. The quality of her attention was remarkable. She was not looking at my face the way a child in distress looks at a stranger searching for threat assessment, cycling through fear and hope in visible flickers. She was looking at me the way a careful person looks at new information, gathering it, sorting it, deciding what it meant. As if she had already, in 11 days of waiting, done the emotional work that most creatures take much longer to accomplish, and had arrived at the far side of it in a state of considered readiness. Then she held out the doll. Not as a gift, not as a surrender, the way a child holds something out when they want you to look at it, when they want you to understand that this is the thing they have, this is what they have made and kept, this is what matters. She held it in both small blue-gray hands and tilted it slightly toward me, and her expression was entirely solemn. "That's a good one," I said. "You made that yourself." She pulled it back. She did not answer, but something in her posture shifted, a millimeter of easing in the line of her shoulders. I sat down on the floor of the cargo bay, right there on the cold composite decking, and I tried to work out what to do next. I did not call station administration right away. I knew that if I called station administration right away, the matter would enter a processing queue, and once it entered a processing queue, it would be handled in accordance with the queue's priorities and the queue's procedures and the queue's logic, which was the logic of administrative systems everywhere. Reduce the open item, close the ticket, move the thing to wherever the thing is supposed to go. I had spent 19 years watching things move through queues. I had learned, in a way I had never examined directly until that moment, that queues were good at handling things that were easy to categorize and poor at handling things that were not. A child with no registration, no file, no official species classification in any system the Haverson had access to, belonging to no one on paper. She would be an open item that the queue did not know what to do with, and the queue would default to the nearest available authority, and I was not yet certain who the nearest available authority was or what they would do with her. So I sat on the floor and I thought about it for a while. She let me think. She did not rush me. She made small adjustments to the doll's construction while I thought, tightening a seam, repositioning something, with the focused attention of a craftsperson correcting their work. After perhaps 20 minutes, I stood up and I said, "There's a room off my office that I think you'd be more comfortable in. It's not much, but it has a cot and it's warmer than this. Would you like to see it?" She looked at me with that appraising amber gaze. Then she stood up, careful, deliberate, adjusting the doll under one arm, and walked toward me and waited. I led the way and she followed, and that was how it began. The problem, as I came to understand it over the following 24 hours, was threefold. and each part of it was worse than the last. The first problem was identification. She carried no papers, no species registry tag, no biological identifier that my station's systems could match to any populated database. The Haverson had access to 4 immigration databases and 2 commercial passenger registries. None of them returned a match. I ran the query 3 times, varying the parameters, and each time I got the same result. No record of a child matching this description, this species type, this probable origin. She was not in any system I had access to. This was not, by itself, unusual. The outer settlement clusters produced children regularly who had never been formally registered anywhere, whose births had been logged in local community records that might or might not be connected to the broader interstellar registry systems. But it meant I could not simply hand her to a coordinator and say, "Here is the file number, here is the record, here is who to call." The second problem was species classification. What I knew about the Velhari, which was what she was, or what I later confirmed she was, matching the species description in the Tethan Accord's appendix against her physical characteristics, could have been contained in a short paragraph. They were a minor designation species under the Tethan Accord's categorization framework, meaning they had no seat at any council, no formal diplomatic representatives, no protected status under the standard colonial transit charters. They had been an indigenous species on 2 worlds in the outer Tethan cluster before the Cavrani extraction operations moved in. There had been a resettlement. The official documentation about the resettlement used the word voluntary. I had processed enough freight manifests out of those worlds to have a general sense of what voluntary meant in that context. The Velhari who remained, and I would later learn the number was smaller than the authorities cared to formally acknowledge, were scattered. There was no Velhari embassy to call. There was no Velhari advocate assigned to the Tethan Passage transit sector. There was a notation in the Tethan Accord's supplementary appendix that Velhari individuals were to be treated as protected transitional migrants, and referred to the Colonial Coordination Office for case processing. The Colonial Coordination Office's case processing average for non-emergency displaced species referrals was 14 months. I sat with that figure for a long time, 14 months of case processing. 14 months in which a small child with no file number and no official advocate would sit in whatever facility the Colonial Coordination Office designated for unprocessed cases, in a queue with things the queue understood better than it understood her, being administered to by people who had not specifically chosen to be in the business of care, but had found themselves there by the logic of institutional assignment. I was not going to let that happen. I had not yet made the decision consciously, but my hands had already stopped filling out the referral form, which told me where I was going. The third problem arrived on the 4th day. His name, as he gave it to me, was Inquisitor Delegate Saras, and he was from the Cavrani Territorial Administration. He was polite. He wore a pale gray coat too clean for a transit hub, and carried a document reader that projected a soft blue glow when he activated it. He was a man of perhaps 50, with the organized features of someone who had spent a career navigating official systems, not cruel-looking, not aggressive, but with a fundamental quality of professional detachment that I recognized from my own mirror on days I had not examined myself carefully enough. He had 2 subordinates who stood near the door and said nothing. He told me that the Cavrani Territorial Administration had been informed of the discovery of an unregistered Velhari juvenile at Haverson Transit Hub, Outpost Verada, and that under the terms of the Territorial Administration's Displaced Species Management Protocol, such an individual was technically classified as a territorial asset pending formal resettlement processing, and that he was authorized to take custody of the child for transport to the designated resettlement facility on Cavrani Prime. He said all of this in the calm, practiced tone of a man who had said it many times before and expected no particular resistance. I asked him for the specific designation of the resettlement facility. He told me it was a processing center, a transition facility, a resettlement support complex. He used 3 different phrases to describe the same thing without once using a phrase that told me what the thing actually was, where it was located, who ran it, or what happened inside it. He said this without any apparent awareness that he was doing it, which was itself a form of information. I asked how the territorial administration had been informed of the discovery. He said the Haverson's standard unclaimed property flagging system generated automatic notifications to relevant administrative authorities. I asked which of the Haverson's notification systems carried territorial administration access, because, as the station's compliance officer, I was not aware of that integration. He did not answer that question. He said the authorization was clear, and that he was prepared to take custody immediately. I told him I would need to verify his authorization against the station's Accord compliance records before I could release any individual from the station's care. This was technically accurate. The Haverson had compliance obligations that meant I could not release an unregistered individual to a third-party representative without verified authorization that met the Accord's own standards. It was also technically a delay, and I think Inquisitor Delegate Saras understood that it was a delay, but I said it in the flat, administrative tone of a man who is simply doing his job, and he could not easily argue with the paperwork without raising questions he apparently did not want to raise. He said he would return with the documentation. I said I looked forward to it, and I walked him back to the hub's transit atrium, because transit compliance officers escort visitors through the compliance sections. This was standard, and I watched him and his subordinates go through the exit seal, and then I went back to my office and I sat down at my desk, and I put my face in my hands for a moment, and then I made some decisions. Her name was Essie. She gave it to me on the second day, when I had established that she understood enough of the common trade language to follow simple sentences if I spoke them slowly and clearly. She had spent the first day mostly quiet, watching the small room I had arranged for her, watching my office through the doorway when I left it open, watching me move around the space with the same careful appraisal she had given everything since I opened the crate. I had brought her food from the hub canteen. The selection was limited, but I had watched what she ate and had paid attention, and I came back from the second trip with things more closely matched to what she had actually consumed rather than what I had assumed she might want. She noticed this. I saw it in the slight shift of her expression when she looked at the tray. "Essie," she said on the second day without preamble or context, just the name offered as a fact. I said it back, trying to put the accent where she had put it, a slight elongation on the first syllable, a softness on the second that was not quite the way my tongue wanted to move. She gave me a small, judicious nod, close enough. We worked out a vocabulary over the following days, pieced together from trade language and gesture and context. She was a precise communicator. She said what she meant and did not embellish. Once, when I missed her actual point by a significant margin, she looked at me with an expression close to impatience and repeated herself slowly, with emphasis on the key word, the way a teacher handles a thoughtful but slow student. She ate everything I brought her, with the deliberate focus of someone who had learned not to waste anything. She did not complain. She did not ask questions I did not know how to answer, except once. She slept in the small room I had cleared for her off the back of my compliance office, a storage room technically, with a fold-out cot I'd borrowed from the station's crew transit section and a thermal blanket from emergency supplies, and she kept her space with a neatness that I found quietly astonishing. The doll sat on the corner of the cot every morning when she woke, placed with precision. Her few things were arranged, as if they had been organized by someone who expected to be inspected. What she asked me on the third day was, "Are they coming back?" I understood who she meant. I told her the truth. which was that I did not know who had brought her here, and that I did not know where they had gone. I did not tell her the rest of what I had assembled from 11 days of silence and a canceled registration identifier. That whoever had put her on that crate had done so knowing they were not going to be there to receive her, that they had done it with the specific intention of placing her in the stream of freight and hoping someone at the other end would be decent enough to stop. I did not tell her that because she was small and because she had been in a sealed crate for 11 days, and because it was not a thing I wanted to say to her while she was sitting on a fold-out cot holding a handmade doll. Someone had loved her very much and had made an impossible choice in a situation where all the choices were terrible. The only thing they could guarantee her was that she would be somewhere else, and somewhere else was better than wherever she had been. She was quiet for a long moment after my answer. "Okay," she said. It was not acceptance in the sense of peace. It was the sound of a creature that had already, in some private internal space, done the necessary work of reckoning with a hard thing, and was now filing it away. The way you file a fact that is too large to carry in front of you all the time, so you put it in a place where it can be retrieved when needed, but does not occupy your hands. I found that harder to be around than grief would have been. Grief I could have done something about. There are known responses, known gestures, known words. That quiet, competent adjustment, the filing away, I could only witness. And witnessing it without being able to change what had made it necessary was a weight I had not carried before, and that I carried from that day forward with varying degrees of grace. I was not a brave man. I want to be clear about that, because the things I am going to describe next might read as brave, and they were not. They were the actions of a man who had spent 19 years processing the paperwork of a transit hub, and who, in the process, had become quietly and comprehensively aware of every gap in the administrative architecture. He worked within every filing delay, every jurisdictional overlap, every protocol that assumed the cooperation of parties who could not be assumed to cooperate. I had 19 years of knowing exactly how the system moved, where it moved slowly, and where it could be made to move even more slowly by someone who understood its procedures and was willing to apply them with absolute fidelity. I could not keep Essie at the Haverson indefinitely. I knew that. Soares would return with whatever documents he needed. The Caverny Territorial Administration had access to resources and relationships I did not, and at some point the weight of official authorization would become more than I could balance against the weight of procedural delay. I estimated I had at most 2 weeks, possibly less, if Soares had faster access to the Accord's override mechanisms than his first visit had suggested. But 2 weeks, if used correctly, could be enough. The first thing I did was file a protective hold notice under the Haverson's own transit charter, which permitted the station to maintain custody of an unregistered minor for the duration of a full compliance review. A full compliance review, when filed correctly, required responses from 7 different administrative bodies across the Tethin Passage network, each of which had their own processing timelines, and those timelines were a matter of official record, meaning I could not be accused of fabricating the delay. I filed it with complete accuracy, following every procedural step, generating every required notification, attaching every relevant documentation set. I was meticulous. I was thorough. I was the 19-year compliance officer doing his job, with the full weight of institutional knowledge behind every keystroke. The second thing I did was contact a woman named Covenant Meyerth. I had never met Meyerth in person. I knew her the way you come to know people over 19 years of transit work, through the paperwork they generate, the shipping records, the occasional routing query. She ran a settlement support operation out of a place called the Verdun Station, 3 relay points along the Tethin Passage from Verada. The Verdun Station was officially registered as a commercial way station with agricultural supply operations. Unofficially, and in the way that everything in the outer passage operated somewhat unofficially, It was a known receiving point for displaced species individuals who needed somewhere to be. That was not a cavern processing center. I was not supposed to know that. I knew it because I paid attention to shipping records over a long period of time, and shipping records, if you read them carefully enough, tell you everything about where people are really going and why. A pattern of small, low-value shipments moving outbound on irregular schedules to settlement clusters that generated no incoming commercial freight was a pattern that meant something specific. I had noticed it years before. I had not acted on the noticing. I had filed it in the same internal space where I filed other things I observed and could not yet do anything about. I messaged Meyer through the station's standard commercial relay, using the routing address associated with an agricultural supply inquiry, which would look like exactly what it appeared to be. I wrote it in the plain, somewhat clumsy syntax of a man who was not practiced at coded language, because I was not practiced at coded language, and I did not think this was the time to attempt something I might do badly. I told her I had a piece of cargo that had been misrouted and needed to find its proper destination. I gave her the cargo description in the terms she would understand: small, fragile, time-sensitive, requiring careful handling, destination uncertain but direction known. I asked her what she could do. She responded within 6 hours. She used the same flat commercial language. What she told me between the lines was that there was a freight run going from Verada to a settlement cluster that was not quite on the official route map, and that if I could get the cargo to the Oregon hauler, the same vessel that had brought Essie to me, as it happened, which was either a coincidence or evidence of an existing network I was only now beginning to understand, it would get where it needed to go. The Oregon was due at Verada in 9 days. I had to keep Soros at bay for 9 days. I told Essie as much as I could without telling her everything, which was not very much. She accepted this with the equanimity she brought to most things. She continued to occupy her small room off my office with her characteristic precision. She continued to eat what I brought her. She began, cautiously, to ask questions about the hub, about the kinds of cargo that came through, about how I decided what went where. I answered these questions honestly and in as much detail as she seemed to want, which was more detail than I had expected. She had the mind of someone who wants to understand systems, who is not satisfied with knowing what a thing does if she can know how it does it. She asked me once what happened to things that nobody claimed. I told her they were held and logged and eventually assessed for what they were worth and sent somewhere appropriate. She thought about this for a moment. What if they're not worth anything? She asked. Most things are worth something, I said. You just have to know what to look for. She looked at me with her amber eyes, weighing this, and then she gave me the small nod that meant she had filed it. Soros came back twice during those 9 days. The first time was on day 6, with a document package that was, I had to concede, working through it with the particular attention I gave to anything with official seals on it, technically insufficient to meet the Haverson's compliance review requirements. 2 of the 7 required administrative responses were missing. The missing responses were from bodies whose processing delays were themselves a matter of official record. I could not expedite them. I was not able to accept an incomplete authorization package. This was not a judgment call. This was the standard. I regretted this, I told Soros, genuinely and without inflection. He looked at me with the expression of a man who had been doing this long enough to recognize delay when he was inside it. It was not an angry expression. It was the expression of a professional who understood that another professional was playing the same game he had played 100 times from the other side, and who was noting, carefully, that this particular professional was better at it than expected. I looked back at him with the expression of a man who was simply following procedure. The second time he came, on day 8, he brought a colleague. The colleague was younger, quieter, and carried himself with a different quality of attention that I recognized from the very few former military men I had processed through the hub over the years. He stayed near the door and did not introduce himself. He watched me with a still, patient attention while Soros spoke, the way a person watches something they are memorizing rather than simply observing. Soros, for the first time, had put down the veneer of professional courtesy and was operating just beneath it, in the colder register. He told me that the Kavrani Territorial Administration had escalated the matter, that the jurisdiction over Velhari displaced individuals had been formally invoked at the Accord oversight level, that he had authorization that superseded the Haverson's compliance review protocol under emergency resettlement provisions. I asked to see the specific override authorization in its complete form, because Haverson Station Charter required that supersession claims be reviewed by the station manager, and that review had to be conducted in accordance with a specific set of procedural steps that took a minimum of 48 hours. He asked whether I was seriously telling him that the station manager needed 48 hours to read a document. I told him the station charter did not require the station manager to read a document. It required the station manager to initiate a structured review that involved multiple procedural stages, and those stages had defined minimum durations, and I could not waive those minimums, and the charter was the charter. The younger man near the door had not blinked. Soros said, "The child will be coming with us, compliance officer, one way or another. The compliance review will be completed by the end of the day after tomorrow," I said. "If the authorization holds under review, the relevant process will proceed accordingly. If you have concerns about the timeline, the appropriate mechanism for escalation is the Accord registrar. I can provide the filing address." He left, the younger man left. The door sealed behind them with the ordinary pneumatic sound of a transit hub door, and I stood in my office for a moment, and then I went in to see Essie, because I needed to know she was all right, and because I found, by that point, that her company was something I had gotten used to in the way you get used to things that turn out to be better than you expected. She was sitting on the cot with the doll, and she looked up when I came in. "They were loud," she said. This was not quite accurate. Soros had not been loud, but I understood what she meant. "They're official people," I said. "They have paperwork that says they're supposed to take you somewhere." She absorbed this without visible alarm. "Are they going to?" "Not if I do my job correctly," I said. She looked at me for a moment. "What is your job?" "Making sure things go where they're actually supposed to go," I said. "Not just where the paperwork says." She thought about this. Then she held up the doll, examining the seam she had been working on, and said, without looking at me, "I think you are good at your job." I went back to my desk and worked until past midnight. Brennick, to his eternal credit, took his 48 hours. He was 6 months from retirement and had no particular love for the Kavrani Territorial Administration, and when I had gone to him the previous evening and explained the situation plainly and in full, he had looked at me for a long, tired moment and said, "Holt, I am going to pretend I don't know what you're planning because I'm an old man who wants a quiet retirement. But I am also going to tell you that the charter review process for external supersession claims takes a minimum of 48 hours, and I have a very thorough method of working through documentation, and I am going to apply every minute of those 48 hours to this particular document." He took every one of them. The Oregon arrived at Verada on day 9. I had 6 hours. I had been preparing Essie for it without being entirely explicit, which I think she knew and did not hold against me. I had told her that she was going somewhere better. I had told her that the place was warm and that there were other people there, other Velhari, I thought, though I could not promise that, and that she would be properly looked after by people who knew more than I did about what she needed. I told her the journey would take a few days and that it would be on a ship, and that the person she would be traveling with knew the route, and that the route was safe, and that I had verified all of this as carefully as I knew how to verify things. She listened to all of this with her solemn, attentive expression. "Are you coming?" she asked. "No," I said. "I can't." She thought about this. Why? I tried to explain it in terms that made sense, that I was needed at the hub, that there were administrative reasons, that the arrangement depended on me staying in place to finish what I had started. All of it was true. None of it was the whole truth, which was that someone needed to remain at the Haverson to complete the compliance review in formal order and answer Soares's questions, and give the whole thing the appearance of a process reaching its proper bureaucratic conclusion, rather than the reality of a child disappearing into a freight network in the 6-hour window between a vessel's arrival and an authorization's completion. That someone was me. There was no one else who knew the paperwork well enough to hold the line, and I was the one who had built the line, and I was not going to abandon it halfway through. "I'll be fine here," I told her. "It's you that matters right now." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, in a voice that was very careful and very deliberate, the voice she used when she was saying something she had decided to say and had weighed before saying, "I will remember." I told her I didn't need her to remember anything. She looked at me as though this were a very foolish thing to have said, but she did not argue. She had learned, in our 10 days together, that there were some statements I made that were not invitations to discussion. I think she understood, even then, that this particular statement was not a truth but a kindness, and she filed it under kindness rather than truth, which was accurate. The transit hand I had arranged, a young woman from the Oregon's crew, someone Meyerth had vouched for in terms I had learned to read, came for Essie in the early hours of the hub's quiet cycle, when traffic through the bays was minimal. I had prepared a legitimate cargo transfer document for her passage, filed under the routing that Meyerth and I had agreed upon. It was not fraudulent. It was silent about some things and accurate about others, in the way that a careful man can make a document that contains no lie and still says something that is not the complete picture. I walked Essie to the bay. I carried the bag of things I had put together for her, a spare thermal wrap, some of the specific foods she'd eaten most readily, a small supply of the medical items the station's transit medic had helped me identify as appropriate for Velhari physiology, and the small handful of other objects she had come to consider hers over 10 days. She carried the doll. The bay was empty at that hour. The Oregon's transit hand was waiting near the secondary access point, a young woman with the look of someone who had made this particular errand before, and who understood that the way to do it was quietly and quickly, and without the kind of manner that draws attention. She gave me a single nod. She crouched down immediately and said something quiet to Essie in a language I did not recognize, but that Essie's body responded to, the slight softening that means you have heard something familiar. At the bay door, Essie stopped and turned around. She held out the doll to me. I understood what she was doing. I understood it completely, and it cost me something to manage my expression correctly in that moment, to keep my face in the register of a man receiving an ordinary thing, rather than a man being given the only currency a small creature has left to spend. She was not giving it to me for safekeeping. She was not asking me to hold it until she came back. She was giving me the only thing she had that was entirely her own, made by her hands, kept through everything, as the only form of payment available to a child who had nothing else and who had decided, in the particular way she decided things, that the debt needed to be acknowledged. I took it in both hands. I held it carefully with the weight it deserved. She looked at me for a moment, that long, amber-eyed appraisal that I had come to know as her way of filing something completely, making sure the record was accurate. Then she gave me a single small nod, turned, and walked toward the transit hand's outstretched hand without looking back. I stood there in the bay and watched until the corridor took her out of sight. Then I went back to my office, and I sat at my desk with a handmade doll on the surface in front of me, and I filed the final documentation for the compliance review, and I waited for Sora's. He came that afternoon. His younger colleague came with him, and there were two more behind the colleague this time, and none of them were in any kind of uniform, which was in some ways worse than uniforms would have been. Sora's patience had entirely elapsed. He was not shouting. He was not that kind of man, but the professional calm had been set aside, and what was underneath it was the colder, harder quality of an official who has decided to stop being subtle. I gave him the full compliance review package, every document in order, every administrative response received and logged, all 7 of them, obtained through the proper channels in the proper time with every procedural step correctly followed and recorded, every form completed to standard. The review was complete. The conclusion of the review, and this was the part I had spent 3 days drafting with a care I had never before applied to anything in 19 years of paperwork, was that the individual in question had not been positively identified through any Tethan Accord registry system, and therefore could not be formally classified as a Caverny territorial asset under the Displaced Species Management Protocol, because that classification required a verified species registry entry. And no such entry existed in any system to which the Haverson had legal access. Without the verified registry entry, the supersession authorization was not applicable to any specific individual, because the authorization referenced a classification that had not been formally established. The review's conclusion was therefore that no individual meeting the authorization's criteria had been confirmed as present at the Haverson Transit Hub. I had spent 3 days drafting that conclusion. It was correct. It was thoroughly, precisely, unassailably correct in every administrative and legal particular. It contained no fabrication, no distortion, no manipulation of fact. Everything it stated was accurate. It simply stated the accurate things in the order, and with the emphasis that led, inescapably, to the conclusion I needed it to lead to. Soares read it. His colleague read it over his shoulder. The 2 men near the door did not move. The conclusion held for what it was, an administrative dead end, airtight and sourced, the work of a man who had spent 19 years learning to build exactly this kind of wall out of exactly this kind of paper. "Where is the child?" Soares asked. His voice was very even. The review found no confirmed individual matching that description in the Haverson's custody, I said. The initial hold was generated on the basis of an unclaimed cargo manifest, and the compliance review addressed the status of all unclaimed cargo in the relevant bay. If there is a discrepancy between the review's findings and the territorial administration's records, you are welcome to submit a formal query to the Tethan Accord's registrar. You moved her. The compliance review is complete and its findings are on record, I said. If you believe there is cause for a further inquiry, the appropriate authority is the Accord registrar. I can provide you with the filing address. He looked at me for a long time. The 2 men near the door looked at me. The young colleague looked at me. I looked back at all of them with the patient, impersonal attention of a man who has all his paperwork in order and knows that they know it too, and that there is nothing in this room or any room that constitutes grounds for anything other than an Accord registrar query, and that the Accord registrar query will take a minimum of 4 months to process. They left. Brennick came and found me an hour later, standing in the doorway of my office with his arms crossed, and a look on his face that was complicated in several directions at once. "Hold," he said. "Yes, sir." That was either the bravest or the stupidest thing I've ever watched someone do with a filing system. "I was following procedure," I said. He stared at me for a long moment. Then he turned and walked back down the corridor, and I heard him mutter something that was not, technically, professional language, but that made me feel, for a moment, considerably less alone than I had in a long time. Nothing came of it officially. There was an inquiry, which moved through the standard administrative channels at the standard pace, and reached the standard inconclusive result, because the documentation was airtight, and the compliance review was correct in every particular, and there was nothing in any record to which any authority could point as evidence of wrongdoing. My record at the Haverson remained clean. Sora's did not return. The Cavreni Territorial Administration registered what I suspected was a formal objection with the Accord's oversight body, but I never saw the result of it, and no one from any official body appeared at my door afterward to demand anything further. Whatever had been escalated apparently found no more traction in the higher channels than it had found in mine. I received, 6 weeks later, a commercial shipping confirmation from a waystation 3 relay points along the passage. It was written in the flat language of cargo logistics, and I read it twice to be sure I understood it correctly, and then I put it in my desk drawer and did not tell anyone about it. The confirmation told me, in the terms Meyerth and I had established, that the cargo had reached its destination and was in good condition. I sat with that for a long time, long enough that the hub's day cycle completed and the light strips shifted to their evening register, and I had not moved from my desk or turned on the office lamp. The doll was still on my desk where I had put it that morning. I had not found a better place for it. I was not sure there was a better place. 19 years of manifests, of discrepancy forms, of keeping track of what belongs to whom. I had spent 19 years in a place where everything was passing through and nothing was meant to stay. And yet the thing I had spent those years doing, the habit of attention, the knowledge of every seam and gap in the administrative architecture, had turned out once to matter in a way that had nothing to do with freight. I kept the doll on my desk. I told no one what it was or where it had come from. People who asked got told it was something I'd had for years. Nobody pressed the point. Transit hub people generally respect the things other transit hub people do not explain. I retired from the Haverson after 3 more years, which took me to the 22-year mark, and I drew my pension to a small unit in one of the residential annexes on Outpost Karev, which was a quiet place and a long way from the Tethin Passage. I was not hiding, precisely. I was simply done. The kind of done that settles into the bones when you have been somewhere too long and have seen too many things move through without stopping, and you begin to want, finally, for something to stop. I planted things in the small plot outside my unit. Nothing that required particular skill or attention, tough, low-maintenance varieties that did not object to variable light or irregular watering, the kind of plants that do not require you to be good at growing things, only present. I cooked my own meals. I read. I slept more than I had in years. I had the particular quiet of a man who has finished a thing and does not yet know what comes next, and has decided to be in that uncertainty without fighting it. The doll sat on the shelf above my small desk, next to the one photograph I kept from the Haverson years, a picture of Brennick and me in the transit atrium on his last day, both of us looking squinting and tired, which was how we had usually looked at each other for 22 years. I did not hear from Meyerth. This was by design. The understanding had always been that the network operated better when its parts did not maintain unnecessary contact. I did not reach out to her. I did not know what had become of the Verdant station, whether it still operated under that name or under any name, whether the routes were still running. I did not know what had become of the broader situation in the Tethin Passage, whether the Cavreni extraction operations had continued their particular interpretation of voluntary settlement, whether anything had changed in the administrative landscape that governed the lives of minor designation species with no seat at any council. I read the news with the same flat attention I had always given it, and what I read suggested that the galaxy's conscience moved at approximately the speed of a compliance review. I had accepted that the doll was likely all I would ever have of it. I had made my peace with this in the way you make peace with things, not by becoming indifferent to them, but by deciding that the weight of them is not a problem to be solved but a thing to be carried, and carrying it without complaint is itself a form of completion. Which is why, 6 years after I retired from the Haverson, when the message arrived, I did not know what to do with it for a full day. It came through the standard residential message service, flagged as a personal communication, no commercial designation. The address header was a long numerical identifier that I did not immediately recognize. From a relay point I had to look up. The relay point was in the outer settlement cluster. The kind of outer cluster that the official route maps listed with minimal detail, a coordinates entry, a basic supply classification, no further information. The message was short. It was written in standard trade language, clean and precise, with a vocabulary that was larger than I might have expected, and a cadence that was careful in the particular way of someone who has worked hard at a language that is not their first one. The grammar was exact. The sentences were structured with deliberate attention. It was the writing of someone who had been precise all their life, and had applied that precision to the acquisition of a new language, and who now used that language the way they used everything, with accuracy and without waste. It said, "You told me you did not need me to remember. I have been thinking about this for 6 years, and I believe you were wrong. I remember. I have made it a point to remember, very precisely, because I decided early on that the correct way to handle the debt was not to feel it passively but to know it actively, and to know it in full, and to keep the account open until I was in a position to do something other than simply feel it. I do not know if this finds you. I am sending it to the last address I was able to find for you through what I should describe only as a careful application of inquiry. If you are reading this, please know the following things. I am well. I have been well for some time. There are others here who are also well. The work continues, which means there are others who are not yet well but who will be in time, because of the existence of a route and a set of people along it who understand what it means to know where things actually need to go. You built something. You may not have thought of it that way. You probably thought of it as paperwork. But there is a word in my language for what you did. I have been looking for the right way to give it to you in trade language, and I do not think trade language has the word exactly, so I will explain it instead. The word means roughly. The act of leaving a door unlocked for someone you do not know is coming, because you have decided that the kind of person you want to be is the kind who leaves doors unlocked. I am going to tell you something else. I became, eventually, one of the people who carries cargo along the route. I know the paperwork now. I know every gap and seam in the administrative architecture, because you taught me what to look for 6 years ago by example. I carry the route forward. Every time I do, I think of you going to one knee on the floor of a cargo bay in a transit hub on the cold shoulder of the Tethan Passage, setting down your scanner and saying hello. I am not saying this to make you feel good about yourself. I am saying it because it is accurate, and I believe in keeping accurate records. I still have the doll. I made a new one when I got here. I kept the first for a reason I did not understand then and understand now. I think you still have mine. If you ever want to write back, I am at the address in the header. If you do not want to write back, I understand that also. Either way, the debt is not closed. Some debts are not meant to close. But I wanted you to know the account is in good order, and the interest has been put to work. I sat at my small desk on Outpost Karev for a long time after reading that message. Long enough that the light changed outside, and the low-maintenance plants did whatever they did in the afternoon, indifferent to me. Long enough that I read it twice more, not because I had misunderstood it, but because there are some things you need to read multiple times before the full weight of them is present, and even then you are not entirely sure the weight is the right weight. I took the doll down from the shelf. It was a small thing, worn soft by years, the color bleached slightly by light and time. Cloth scraps and thermal lining and a child's precise, careful construction. 11 days in a sealed crate and she had made this. She had made it and she had kept it, and then she had given it to the only thing she had to give it to, because a small creature in an impossible situation will find a way to give something rather than nothing if the person in front of them has earned it. I thought about what I had been when I crouched down on that cargo bay floor, a man without anywhere better to be. A man who knew every gap in a system he had never loved, and who had spent 2 decades moving freight through a passage on the cold shoulder of the galaxy, and who was good at this thing he had never been passionate about, and for whom that ordinary, unglamorous, unheroic competence had turned out once to be enough. Not a brave man, not a righteous man, not a man with a plan or a cause or a particular sense of destiny. Just a man who could not close a manifest on a child and walk away, because something in him, some functional baseline of decency that had survived 19 years of transit compliance without being ground away, had simply refused, and who happened to know, with 19 years of practice precision, exactly how to be a stone in the administrative gears when a stone was what was needed. I had not thought I had built something. I had thought I had done one thing once for one person, and that the one thing had been enough to justify itself without requiring a larger frame. That had seemed sufficient. I had lived inside that sufficiency for 6 years without complaint. She had made it into something else. She had carried it forward and found the seams and filled them in and kept the root alive and become, in the process, one of the people who runs the thing that other people's children depend on. Not because someone had appointed her to it. Because she had watched, in a cargo bay in Outpost Verada, what it looked like when an ordinary man decided, without drama and without audience, that some things were not going to happen on his watch. And she had taken that watching and made it into knowledge, and made it into work. I held the doll for a while. Then I set it back on the shelf, precisely where it had been. I pulled up the message. I looked at the address in the header, the long numerical identifier, the relay point in the outer cluster, for a long time. I am not much of a correspondent. I told her that when I finally wrote back, because it was true and because she deserved accuracy. I told her I was retired and growing plants that did not require me to be good at growing them, and sleeping well and reading, and that Outpost Karev was a quiet place, and that I had found in the years since the Haverson that I was better suited to quiet than I had known. I told her the doll was on my shelf, where it had been since the day she gave it to me, and that it was there because it belonged there, and I had known that from the moment I took it from her hands. I told her the account was not how I would have described it myself. I would not have called it a debt. I would have called it a manifest, an accurate record of what arrived at a waystation and what it was, and where it was actually supposed to go, as opposed to where the paperwork said. And then I told her what I had never said to anyone, because there had never been anyone to say it to, and because by the time there was someone to say it to, 6 years had passed and I had organized myself around not saying it, and it took a long time to find the right words, and I was not certain, even when I sent it, that they were the right ones. That when she had walked down that corridor without looking back, it had taken everything I had to keep my face still and my hands at my sides. That the doll on my desk had been the hardest thing I had ever kept, and the only comfort I had let myself hold, and that I had held it without knowing whether I was keeping it for her or for myself, and had eventually concluded that this distinction did not matter as much as the fact of the keeping. That I had thought about her, not every day, because that would have been a kind of sentimentality I had no right to, and I had spent 19 years in transit compliance learning not to attach to what was passing through, but often, and with the particular quality of thought you give to something that arrived when you were not ready and changed something that you could not name and could not fully measure, only carry. I sent the message. Then I went outside and checked on the plants, because they did not care about any of this and the indifference was steadying, and because I had learned over the years that the right way to receive something large is to stand next to something small and ordinary for a while. When I came back in, there was already a reply waiting. It said, "I know, I could tell." And then it said, "I am glad you kept it." And then very simply, "I am coming this way in 4 months. I thought I should tell you." I sat down in my chair in the quiet unit on Outpost Karev, 6 years retired from the transit hub on the cold shoulder of the Tethan Passage, a man who had spent his working life moving things to where they were actually supposed to be. I held the message on the screen. I held the fact of it, and the 4 months it contained, and the specific weight of what it meant that she had said she was coming and had thought she should tell me. I looked at the dial on the shelf. There are some records that only make complete sense in hindsight, that require the full span of the thing before you can see what the entries add up to. This was one of them, a manifest that had seemed for 6 years to close with a single line item, one small thing, arrived unclaimed, delivered to where it needed to go. Now I could see it had been running all along, longer than I knew, in other hands than mine, doing work I had not imagined it would do. I wrote back. The message was 4 words. It was the right number of words. "Come for dinner, come soon." I hit send before I could think about it any more than I already had. Then I went to the small kitchen and looked at what I had, and started making a list of what I would need. It is a long way from the outer settlement cluster to Outpost Karev. 4 months is time enough. I had a list to work from and a shelf with a doll on it, and through the window the low-maintenance plants were doing whatever they did in the late afternoon, and the light was what it always was on Karev at this hour, flat, clean, ordinary. The kind of light that does not demand anything. The kind of light that simply lets what is there be seen. That was enough. It had always been enough. I just hadn't known until it came back that enough could grow.